for the Georgia Council of Substance Abuse. And welcome everybody to part 2 of the Compassion Fatigue webinar. But before we start, let's get into some housekeeping information. Those who stay for the entirety of the webinar will receive 1.5 CEUs. You will not get a certificate, but you will receive a follow-up email thanking you for your participation during this webinar. Just to remind y'all, make sure that you keep track of your CEU credits for the end of the year by making a list that has the month that you attended the training, the topic, and the panelists. So make sure you're keeping a list so that you can submit it at the end of the year. If you have any questions during the presentation, make sure that you put your questions in the Q&A box. If you have any comments, you could put it in the chat box. But if you have any questions, put it in the Q&A box. And also, we'll try to answer them throughout the presentation. But for the most part, we're going to try to leave about 10 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer questions. There will be a self-care worksheet in the Dropbox that'll be provided during the presentation, sort of in the middle, but it'll be in the chat box. I'll put it in there. And a PDF file of the entire slideshow will be provided as we close out. I think that's everything that I need to cover. And without further ado, I want to introduce our facilitator today, and that is Owen Doherty. So you could take it away, Owen.
Great. Thanks so much, Dwayne. So Dwayne is going to help me by tracking the Q&A, and then we'll stop several times throughout the presentation and try and answer your questions. We're going to limit the sharing of the participants primarily because of time. We've got a fair amount of material we want to cover, and last time, 2 months ago, I did the first part of this webinar, and in that webinar, we kind of didn't get to all the material because so many people started to share from the floor, if you will. So we're really going to limit it. Dwayne and Laurie are going to help me out with reviewing the comments and the questions. And if you have questions, we do ask you to click on the icon that says Q&A, and then we'll stop several times to answer those. We're going to talk today about compassion fatigue and peer recovery support services. So our objectives in this time together, we're together until 1 o'clock, is we want to explore the relationship between recovery and resilience and the ways in which recovery can help us as we encounter something called secondary stressors and our own traumatic memories in the providing of peer-based recovery support services. So we'll dig a little deeper. We covered some of those things. We talked about secondary stressors and traumatic memories in our last webinar, which was 2 months ago. And we'll revisit some of that material just in case you weren't with us that last time. We want to also build an understanding that compassion fatigue is very real. And it's a hazard or a pitfall for those of us who provide peer-based recovery support services. We want to look at the current environment, which may bring some social isolation, increased demand for peer services, new ways of providing these services, and for many, it may require us to discover and practice new means of support to address secondary traumatic stress and avoid compassion fatigue. And then we want to realize that people who provide peer-based recovery support services and those who support us really have to do some focus on assistance, support, and professional help when we need it. We also have to, it's absolutely necessary that we practice self-care, and we'll talk about some ways that we can look at that. So here's how we're going to get there to those objectives. We're going to start with a very brief roll call, poll to look at who's here. And then we want to start by focusing on resilience and recovery. Then we'll revisit some of what we covered 2 months ago in June and talk about compassion fatigue, what it is, how it happens, why it's important for those of us who provide peer services, and what's different about providing those services these days with COVID-19, which has changed the ways in which many of us work, with the whole movement of Black Lives Matter, with increased political polarization, and for some of us, with unemployment or having employment that's threatened. So we want to look at how that has an impact on compassion fatigue in providing these services that we provide. We'll look at what are some of the symptoms of compassion fatigue and then what we need to do to prevent it and to address it. So that's our roadmap for our time together. As Dwayne mentioned, we're going to ask you to use the chat box for comments. So if you want to give an amen, or you agree with some things that are being said, or you disagree with them, you can make those statements in the chat box. And if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box, and we'll stop at several points to address those. We'll also have a couple of breakout sessions where you get an opportunity to share with each other. So we're going to start by asking who's with us. And Dwayne, I'm going to ask you to launch the poll. And let us know, are you a peer providing support to people in or seeking recovery? Are you a family member or close friend of someone who's in or seeking recovery? Are you a person who supervises peers? And are you someone who's primarily involved in administration or administrative services, or a person providing clinical services to people seeking recovery, or something that doesn't fit into those categories? I think you can only choose one, so pick the one that most accurately describes the work you're doing now.
Can you see the polls, Owen?
I can, and I can see the responses that are coming in too.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to get your answers in. I think we have 15, 16, 17, 18. I think most people have responded. So we're going to end the polling. And so let's share the results with everybody. So the vast majority of people with us today are people who are peers providing services. And then we also have some supervisors. We have a family member, a person who's working in administration, and someone who's primarily involved in providing clinical services. So that's great, because most of what we're going to be talking about is aimed at those of you who are providing services, as well as those who are supervising people providing services. So we're going to start here. Before we dive into compassion fatigue, we want to talk about resilience and recovery. And after our last webinar on this topic 2 months ago, we sent out a survey and got some results. And one of the things that struck me in reviewing the results is that those of us in recovery have some skills that we've developed that help us to face this compassion fatigue. And some of those skills, some of those abilities are linked to the resilience that we develop and discover as we move through the process of recovery. So we're going to start by looking at those strengths that we have that are linked to our resilience. Some of it we built actually when we were in the process of using substances, but a lot of it we developed as we recovered from our substance use disorder. So what is resilience? I'll give you a definition that I discovered that I liked well. I think it suits us. So resilience is the ability to recover from setbacks, adapt well to change, and keep going in the face of adversity. Learning to become more resilient can offer individuals the opportunity to improve our lives, maximizing our potential and our success. Now, interestingly enough, that definition does not come from some peer definition or somebody writing about substance use and recovery. It comes from someone writing in the Harvard Business Review. So some of my history is that I have a degree in organization development and have worked in large corporations in the field of organization development. So I read things like the Harvard Business Review. But I like the definition because I think it suits us well for our purposes. And it really does apply to those of us who are recovering from substance use disorders, and to our families, our allies, and our friends. We become resilient as we recover from setbacks, adapt to change, and keep going in the face of adversity. We learn to become more resilient, and then we can offer ourselves the opportunity to improve our lives, maximizing our potential and our success. So that really links to resilience and recovery. So I'm going to ask you, Dwayne, to help us break out into groups for a 5-minute conversation. I think we currently have almost 30 participants. So Dwayne, why don't we break out into 9 groups? And you'll be assigned to a group. We ask you to accept the invitation and join in the small group, and talk about your experience and how recovery, either your own recovery or your family, as a family member recovering, how that recovery has helped you to develop the ability to recover from life's challenges, to adapt to change, and to keep going in the face of adversity. You're going to have a 5-minute conversation, and we'll call you back. Yes, Dwayne.
Owen, it may be on your screen, but I'm not given the option to put people in breakout rooms for some reason.
Let me see if I have it. So are you the host or am I the host?
I'm the host.
That may be because we're in a webinar mode rather than a regular Zoom mode. But I see you're right. I mean, I do not have the ability to, I don't have the ability to put people in breakouts. But I'd like to get some feedback from individuals about how has recovery given you or allowed you the ability to develop the ability to recover from life's challenges, adapt to change, and or keep going in the face of adversity. So if we could get you to raise your hand, if you have the ability to raise your hand, we'll unmute 1 or 2 of you to share how you have experienced this ability in your recovery.
I'm paying attention to the chat to see if anybody wants to put anything in the chat as well. Nobody's raised their hand though. And you can actually,
Two participants that's raised their hand. 3, you got Catherine, 2. I'll allow you to talk, Catherine.
Hey.
Yes, Catherine.
Cool. Okay. So recently, I have 4 years in recovery now, and I've had using dreams, you know, pretty much the whole 4 years. But recently, with all of the pedophilia stuff that I've seen, it has triggered a lot of dreams from my trauma, and it's been very overwhelming. And what my recovery has helped me do is to reach out to my doctor, my counselor, and a few of my friends in recovery, and to speak on those things. And for the first time last night, I had no bad dream. So this is brand new, and I appreciate y'all for letting me share that.
Thank you, Catherine. And then Christopher Sheffield, you had your hand raised. I think you're... Can you unmute Christopher Sheffield, Dwayne?
All right, I'm unmuted now.
Okay.
All right. Well, I wanted to share on all 3 points. One, my life, how recovery has helped me is one, with the first one in developing the ability to recover life challenges, is that my life experience has helped me to more readily identify the potential pitfalls that may be that I may be facing based on the decisions that I'm proposing to make. So now I'm a lot more aware of my environment and my surroundings. 2, adapting to change. My recovery has allowed me the ability to accept the responsibilities for the things that I can affect. See, you know, so for so many years, I wasted so much time investing in changing things that I had no impact on. But today, I have a more centralized focus in regards to those things which I actually have the ability to affect and to change. So I don't have a whole lot of wasted motion, for lack of better terms. And last but not least, my recovery has helped when it comes to facing adversity is that my life experience has proven to me that continuously working in spite of evidence or lack thereof, that eventually a breakthrough will occur.
Wow.
So I have faith today based on that life experience.
Thanks so much, Christopher. So you're the former Steeler.
Yeah, I'm the former Pittsburgh Steeler.
So I live about an hour east of Pittsburgh now. I lived in Georgia. I was in CARES 2, and I used to work for Georgia Council. So it's good to meet you remotely, Christopher.
Outstanding. I want to let you know that I thoroughly enjoyed Compassion Fatigue Part 1. It was awesome.
Good. And we can make sure, I saw your chat mention, we'll make sure you get the PDF from Part 1.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay. And so Nathaniel Kendrick, you have something to share on these points. Can we unmute Nathaniel?
I think I'm unmuted now.
Good.
First of all, I hope everyone is doing well. And for me, specifically, recovery has helped me to deal with all 3 of these things. For me, I've learned how to keep it pretty simple by employing and honestly trying my best to live up to these principles each and every day, especially the self-discipline and the perseverance, awareness of God, but also the awareness of myself. It's helped me to develop the ability to recover from life's challenges, because challenges never stop. Look at the world we live in today, specifically. And I'm also in one of those businesses that has been shut down since the beginning of this new age of the pandemic. So it's allowed me to develop the ability to adapt to changes and to keep going on in the face of adversity. And that's really what I've learned about being in recovery. I was also I worked at a facility for a short while, and I'm fortunate enough to sponsor a bunch of gentlemen in this process. And in the short 13 years that I have been in this process, that has been the biggest asset to my life. Keeping the focus on myself and understanding that I'm going to make mistakes pretty much all the time, and to forgive myself, not beat myself up for making those mistakes. And I've learned, I missed the very first seminar, which I would love to receive a PDF of that myself. But the compassion fatigue too, I wanted to be a part of because I have developed compassion in certain areas, especially when it comes to dealing with peers and with recovery. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nathaniel. And so what we can do, I think, Dwayne, if you don't have it, I can send it to you. We can send out the PDF for both presentations. That we're going to repeat a lot of the core of that first presentation today, but we'll make sure you get the PDFs from both. So I'll send them to Dwayne and Laurie, and then we can distribute them to everybody. And then we have Benjamin Young. If you could just briefly share what you want to share, and then we're going to move ahead.
And I wanted to, we had somebody in the chat room, Sanja Middleton says, recovery taught me that I am enough and I am not my diagnosis. My recovery has taught me that my story has power.
Great. So I see additional people are raising their hands. We're just going to hear from Benjamin, and then we're going to move ahead so we can manage our time. So thanks. I see Charles Hines, you've got your hand up. We'll give you some opportunity to share later. Benjamin Young. Can we unmute Benjamin Young?
Let's see here.
There we go. Huh.
He should be, there you go, Benjamin. Unmute yourself. All right, Benjamin, he's not able to, I'm trying to move.
Okay, we're going to move ahead just because of time.
Unmuted.
There you
Here we
go.
go.
Owen, you're my favorite guy. I'm from CARES 23. And I'd like to share about that resilience. When the webinar came available, I had to join. And what recovery has given me is the ability to be present.
Yeah.
The ability to be present. And working in treatment allows me to see the disease in full effect constantly. So the resilience piece is real popular, is real powerful and effective in my life because I've learned to find a level of acceptance, realizing that but by the grace of God. So I appreciate recovery. I've learned to not take me too serious, but always be mindful that the disease is always active. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. We're going to move ahead because we need to just to manage our time. Charles Hines, I saw your hand. We're going to ask you if you can to put your comments in the chat box, or if you have a question, just go ahead and put it in the box for Q&A. So thank you for sharing that. And this is a lot of what Charles is persistent, so could we unmute Charles Hines? It seems like he really has something he wants to say. So let's unmute Charles Hines and we'll hear from him. And Charles, if we can do it briefly, then we'll move ahead.
Unmute yourself, Charles.
I thought I had my hand down. Sorry about that. But at any rate, recovery has afforded me to come out of the darkness to the light of the truth, you know, because I've had a whole lot of setbacks as far as cancer and a whole lot of things. And had I not been in recovery, I'd probably been dead right now. So it has afforded me the opportunity to face life on life's terms. Thanks.
Great. And so all three of those really apply for you, Charles. Thank you for sharing that. So here's another way to look at resilience. And what we want to look at here is the qualities of resilient people. And think about how you possess these qualities, because it's resilience that can help us as we encounter compassion fatigue and some of the traumatic memories that come up for us as we provide peer services. So I know for myself, I can see how I've developed these qualities as my recovery has progressed. And that one is a staunch acceptance of reality. So for many of us, recovery helps us to live life on life's terms. And that means that we're accepting reality as it is. And that the use of substances for some of us helped us to dodge that acceptance of reality. Resilient people also have a deep belief, often buttressed by strongly held values, that life is meaningful. And so I saw Ron White is an old friend of mine. We've known each other for a long time. I saw you entered in the chat box earlier, Ron, that your faith is really important in helping you to be resilient. So for you, your values, those strongly held values are linked to faith, and they are for many of us. But faith is usually a framework that helps us to understand and believe and live a life that we see as being meaningful. And sometimes the meaning of our life can be a mystery to us, but recovery helps us to trust that life is meaningful. And resilient people have an uncanny ability to improvise. So isn't that true with recovery? That one of the things we learn as we recover is how to improvise. That when something doesn't work anymore, we learn how to change direction, pick up the pieces, and keep moving. So we can bounce back from hardship with just one or two of these qualities. But to be truly resilient, it helps if we develop all three. Resilient people face reality with staunchness, make meaning of hardship instead of crying out in despair, and improvise solutions from thin air. And if we think about our friends who just shared, that we hear this in their stories of what they shared, that they've made meaning out of hardship, and they've improvised solutions, and they've found a way to keep life meaningful. So another way to look at resilience is to think about the skills that we develop in being resilient. And Eric Gentry and Anna Baranowski are two people who have done a lot of study. They're clinicians who have studied the area of compassion fatigue. And so in their studies, they came to identify these 5 skills for resiliency. And in talking to peers who provide peer services, These skills are skills we develop supporting our recovery and also in supporting others in their recovery. So something called self-regulation, and that's the ability to intentionally control our energy and our responses. So when we think about those two areas of our lives, our own recovery and how we support others in their recovery, we need to become self-regulating, which means that we are intentional and we control how we interact with other people, how we respond to what they present to us. That intentionality is the ability to be deliberate rather than reactive. So when I think about the sharing we just heard from the gentleman who shared with us, they talked about their intentionality, how they were deliberate rather than reactive, and they chose actions that matched their intentions. Something that Gentry and Baranowski identify as perceptual maturation. So when I think about my development, I'm a person in long-term recovery. Later this month, I'll be celebrating 29 years in recovery. And as I approach that milestone, I think about how my perceptions have changed. That my perceptions when I first started my recovery journey were really skewed. They were skewed and they were self-centered. And as my recovery has matured me, what I've become more aware of is how my actions impact other people. And my ability to take responsibility for that has increased. And another resiliency skill that Dr. Gentry and Dr. Baranowski identified is the ability to connect and be supportive. And the ability to accept support. The other resiliency skill, and we're going to talk more about this a little bit later, is skill around self-care and revitalization. So we're going to move into a revisit of some of the things we talked about on compassion fatigue. Dwayne, do we have any questions? I know we have some comments in the chat box. So
We have no questions right now.
okay. And it looks like there's no, Nikki Sharpton, my imperfections have made me perfect for my purpose. And let's see if anybody else. Somebody, Jerry Green, has gotten a lot closer to his family. Okay. So I guess just to get some feedback in the chat box, anybody who cares to share, does what we've said here about these resiliency skills, does this link with your experience in recovery? So if we could get some comments in the chat box about that, that would be helpful. Anybody?
Ronald White says yes.
Okay. Anybody else? Well, I wonder, Dwayne, could we unmute Ron White, and maybe Ron can tell us what he resonates with, what resonates with his experience.
Yeah, we could do that. All right, Ronald, you can unmute yourself.
Ron, are you there?
Ronald? He's unmuted.
Hey, Ron? Okay.
He said
maybe
he's
not.
having problems. He said he's
Okay.
having problems.
So Chris Sheffield relates to self-regulation. Ron is having problems. Anybody else? Do you relate to any of these resiliency skills and your recovery? Okay, we're going to move ahead then. So we're going to talk about compassion fatigue, and I'm going to start with this definition is from a researcher who's done a lot of work on compassion fatigue, Dr. Charles Figley. And he identified it way back in the 1990s as a concept that refers to the emotional and physical exhaustion that can affect helping professionals and caregivers over time. It's associated with gradual desensitization to stories, a decrease in the quality of our care, an increase in errors, higher rates of depression and anxiety disorders among the helpers, rising rates of stress leave, that's taking time off because of stress, and degradation in the workplace climate. So the workplace climate, it disintegrates. Helping professionals have also found that their empathy and ability to connect with their loved ones and their friends is also impacted. And that this, over time, can lead to increased rates of stress in the household, divorce, social isolation, and the most insidious aspect of compassion fatigue is that it attacks the very care of what brings us to this work, our empathy and our compassion for others. So Dr. Figley did a lot of research in this, and he's been working in this field for 30 years. And what he identifies is that it's very dangerous because it has this impact not only on our work, but it also has this impact on our home lives. So let's talk about how it happens. And we talked about this the last time. For those of you who are with us, we're going to revisit this model that Dr. Figley developed back in 2001. So Dr. Figley Dr. Figley talks about exposure to suffering, and those of us who care, and so most of his research was not done on people providing peer support. It was done on people who are social workers, people who are nurses, people who are EMTs, emergency responders. And he saw that people in these kinds of work, and it certainly applies to peer support, have generally a heightened empathic ability. So we come to the work with an ability to empathize. And if you look at this cylinder in the lower left portion of the screen, we also have a concern for others. And so we bring that to an exposure to suffering, and we have something called an empathic response. So we spent a lot of time on this in our last webinar, but we respond with empathy in this encounter with our peers. Out of every one of those empathic responses, whether we're conscious of it or not, we walk away from hearing their stories of distress with some leftover compassion stress. So the compassion that brings us to the work is stressed in this empathic response. And in that stress, we walk away with, whether we're conscious or not of it, with some level of residual compassion stress. As we hear the challenging and difficult stories of others, we take some of the stress away with us. Now, two things that help us to encounter that stress and to minimize the residual stress, what we walk away with, are a sense of satisfaction. So think about your encounter with a peer where you walked away and you felt very highly satisfied because you felt like something happened there that made a difference. And the other thing that Figley identified is something he calls detachment. And we're going to come back to that term because one of the things I've discovered in some focus groups I've done with people providing peer support, that word is not satisfying to us who provide peer support. But Figley calls it detachment. We'll come back and revisit that. So that detachment and that sense of satisfaction help to minimize the stress we walk away with. Now, some things that add into the reality of compassion fatigue are our prolonged exposure to this suffering. So the longer we do this, and the more stories we hear, that adds into the reality of compassion fatigue. And traumatic memories. So someone was just sharing about her traumatic memories and how she's been very much aware of them in the middle of everything that's happening. And then something called other life demands. Now we're going to come back and talk a little bit more of the right-hand side of the screen, but I want to stop for a minute and answer any questions that we might have, or invite some comments in the chat box. Does this make sense to people? Do you relate to it? And as you think about the reality of providing peer support, what do you relate to in this model of looking at how compassion fatigue develops? Anybody?
Lucy Todd says she can relate to it all. Julie Roberts says she can definitely relate. Catherine Tootle says that the leftover stress from stories. I guess she's making a comment that
she relates to that. Yeah.
Vicky says it makes perfect sense.
Great. Okay. Anybody have any questions about this model, about this way of understanding compassion fatigue?
No questions. Julie works as a case manager, though.
Okay.
I know that could be stressful.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to assume that this makes sense, and I want to talk about a couple of these areas. So we'll go a little bit deeper into some of these areas. So that leftover stress from hearing the stories that Catherine Tootle, that you related to strongly, is something called secondary traumatic stress. So secondary traumatic stress happens when we become traumatized, not directly, but by hearing about traumatic events experienced by someone else. Indirect exposure to trauma may occur in the context of a familial, social, or professional relationship. And the negative effects of this secondary traumatic stress are the same as those of primary traumatic stress. We might experience traumatic intrusive imagery. So the imagery keeps coming back to us uninvited. We have dreams, we have ways of hearing this or thinking about the stories. That we have hyperarousal, so we might be very sensitive, become angry easily. Or we might have distressing emotions. I had a friend who used to talk about in his recovery something called kind of evasive anxiety. So we might just have distressing emotions and free-floating anxiety that isn't related to something necessarily that we're conscious of in our lives. Or we might have hard time doing our job. And in the most severe instances, secondary traumatic stress that we experience in providing peer services might result in significant distress or impairment that even can become a warranted diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I saw in the chat box that Jennifer Castro mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder. So secondary traumatic stress is a reality of providing peer support, and it stays with us. We're not always conscious of it, so it might come upon us in unexpected ways. The other thing I wanted to invite some comment on is other life demands. So when we go back to that we see this box up here, number 10, other life demands. And in our reality today, for many of us, life has been turned upside down. So even how we provide peer support, maybe we've lost our jobs, maybe we've lost income, maybe we are isolated in ways that is difficult for us to experience. And we're experiencing other life demands. So some of the ones I've heard people talk about is the demands on the family, particularly now. I spent some time with some family members of mine, and the people with children are really distressed by the uncertainty about what's going to happen with the school year. And then how they're going to care for their children, especially those of them who are working and at the same time fulfill the demands on their job. Something called quarantine fatigue. So those of us who are isolated from others and experiencing intermittent or consistent quarantine are finding that we get very tired of that social separation. For some of us, learning how to work remotely has been challenging, especially if we're sharing households with other people. And then I've heard people talk about remote working and financial insecurity and the whole reality of racial injustice and the related traumatic memories people are experiencing because of the way that there's a spotlight shown on Black Lives Matter and racial inequity. So I want to invite, if anybody has comments in the chat box that they'd like to make about any of these other life demands and how they're impacting your lives. I'd love for us to spend a moment talking about these other life demands. Catherine Tootle says, one of my other life demands is simply being a mother. And Julie Roberts talks about quarantine fatigue. Marlissa Bailey, familial separation.
Separation as I live hundreds of miles away in the midst of this health crisis. My parents are in the high risk group. I have children and grandchildren that I could not touch for months.
Right.
Charity Marcus says, yes, I have experienced this secondary stress and didn't realize it immediately. I found myself tired and not present after work hours, such as when attending my family events. Physical exercise after work and before family time helps. Quarantine fatigue is real for my teen children, and my self-care is more important than ever. Julie Roberts says, I have MS and a comprised immune system. Vicky says, it has been difficult to take care of family responsibilities, my own recovery in quarantine, and still help others with their recovery. Wow.
Yeah. So thank you, because those comments are very helpful to us. I'm going to move on to the next thing, because here what we're talking about is that if your comments are so helpful because they illustrate why this is important for those of us providing peer recovery support services, or for all people who are in these caring jobs at work where empathy is a critical component of what we do. So those of us providing peer services, connection is critical to the way we do our work. That we can't do peer services without connecting to our peers. The other point I want to make is, as we look at this diagram again, this area is something called detachment. Counselors, medical professionals, social workers, they all study the importance of detaching. And for those of us doing peer services, we study the art of connecting. So think about your training as a CARES. We study motivational interviewing, we study cultural competence, we study the ways, all the dynamics that are important for us in making connections. But we don't spend a lot of time studying this area of detaching or separating. And we're gonna come back and talk some more about that. So as we look at providing peer services, we're not all very skilled at that separation. The other thing that's really important as we look at the diagram is that each of us brings some level of traumatic memory to our encounters. So each of us has experienced trauma in our substance use disorder, and that might look different for each of us, but trauma is almost an inevitable part of the reality of substance use disorder. So if we look at this providing peer support services, this prolonged exposure to suffering is a very big box. In our current environment, other life demands can become a very big box because of parenting, because of being a child of vulnerable parents, because of separation from normal support systems, that because of those of us who are accustomed to receiving our support in in-person recovery group meetings, possibly 12-step meetings or other support groups, and not being able to experience that support. And because of traumatic memories that are being, have a light shined on them because of the stories we hear, we're very vulnerable for compassion fatigue. So I want to stop and just check in with you, Dwayne. I see Dan Bailey says, I have many other life demands. I'm fairly good at detaching my work life from personal life, but most of my self-care occurs during the hours spent in my personal life. Self-care during work life is what I need more of. So that's a helpful contribution. And then Dwayne, do we have any other comments or chats?
Nathaniel says, learning detachment can be helpful. Developing this ability comes difficult for some and not for others. I am one that has been able to detach without great difficulty. I know many in the field that cannot.
Okay. Good. Thanks for all that. And then I guess we don't have a lot of questions, so I'm going to assume that most of what we're saying is making sense to people. So I want to look at this progression. So each of us in the work we're doing has the encounter with secondary traumatic stress. That can lead us to compassion fatigue. And if we don't address it, it can ultimately wind up in burnout. So what is burnout? The World Health Organization identifies burnout as chronic work-related stress, where we experience a lack of motivation, energy depletion or exhaustion, which some people have referenced in their comments, reduced efficacy or the work, we're doing the work, but it's not as effective as it may have been. And it may result from unresolved secondary traumatic stress or compassion fatigue. And it may not be reversible. So that's the important piece, that the World Health Organization identifies that if this progression happens, where we move from compassion fatigue to burnout, we may not be able to reverse it. And we may not be able to continue to do this work that many of us love and that our caring and compassion have brought us to. So it's important that we learn ways to address the compassion fatigue and the secondary traumatic stress. So some of the symptoms of compassion fatigue are emotional exhaustion. This is from SAMHSA and the American Institute on Stress. Emotional exhaustion, anxiety, fear, sadness, anger, and guilt. Some folks have already shared that they are experiencing some of this. Reduced sense of personal accomplishment or meaning in our work. Some difficulty making decisions, reduced satisfaction at work, and possibly reduced stamina. We might have angry outbursts or wind up crying for reasons that we don't fully understand. And we might wind up avoiding others and have decreased interactions with others. This depersonalization of other people and physical exhaustion. So those are all identified symptoms of compassion fatigue. So if we're facing these areas, how can we possibly provide peer support? So peer support that is driven by our compassion for others, the connections we're able to make with others, our ability to relate to their experiences. So if we wind up with these symptoms, our ability to make those connections can really be compromised. Dwayne, do we have any questions or any chats?
We do not.
Okay.
Nathaniel added that learning methods of self-care, spiritual, mental, and physical are needed.
Great. And we're going to move right into that as we talk about what we can do about it. and we've already had people sort of touching on that as we move through this material. So what can we do about it? And I want to, I think we talk about self-care and we think about exercise and we might think about meditation, but I want to look at self-care in a more holistic fashion. And Dwayne, I'm going to ask you to send out in the chat box the worksheet that I provided you with. And that worksheet really looks at these 5 possible areas where we might amplify our own self-care or focus our self-care. Because I look at it in these 5 areas that some of it has to do with physical well-being. Some of it has to do with strengthening, beefing up our systems of support.
So it's not letting me put it in the Dropbox, but what I can do is I will send it to everybody individually afterwards, and I can share my screen now if you would like them to look at it.
Why don't we do that? But let me finish these 5 categories, and then we can bring it up if you would, Dwayne.
Okay.
So some of us might need to beef up or revitalize our systems of support. So if my primary system of support for my own recovery has been 12-step meetings, and I can't, though they're not in person and the Zoom meetings are not doing it for me, then I may have to reach out and make individual connections in new ways. Some of us really are experiencing some of this, but we're not fully aware of the ways in which we're experiencing it. So beefing up our self-awareness might be helpful. And then rather than looking at detachment, because I do think many of us providing peer support have a hard time with that word, think about the dynamic of connecting and separating. So separating is as important as connecting. And there are some things we can do that help us with that dynamic. I'm going to touch on those in just a minute before we look at the worksheet that Dwayne has. And then if we think about that diagram, one of the things that Figley really stresses is the importance of focusing on our sense of satisfaction. So what's the satisfaction we get? What's the satisfaction we get from providing this empathic response? And sometimes we have to remind ourselves of how that works for us. So I want to talk about those 2 areas, the compassion, satisfaction, but the correct connecting and separating. So some of you have shared you don't have a problem with detachment, but many people do. So I've done some focus groups with people providing peer support, and one of the things I've gotten feedback on is a lot of folks who provide peer recovery support find that thought difficult. So I want to frame it in a different picture frame and look at ways that we can really identify with the importance of separating as much as the importance of connecting. So one of the things that can help us with this is supervision. And we may have to seek more supervision to help us understand what's ours and what's not ours. Alan Lime, who does a lot of the training on motivational interviewing in the CARES Academy, and I'm assuming he still does that, was really big on us having an identity that we are not about fixing people. And I think this helps us to keep our empathic connection in perspective. That the work we do is not about fixing. It's really about presence and possibly helping people to surface their own ability to find a pathway to recovery. So another thing is that intentional peer support is an approach to providing peer support that we've done some study in with CARES. And in the intentional peer support, they talk about the importance of boundaries and limits. So if we think about the limits of how we support others and our need for personal limits, as well as our need to establish boundaries with the people we provide supports to, that can help us with this dynamic of connecting and separating. Also, if we look at your CARES ethical behavior guidelines, there's some real specific guidelines in there that help us to establish those boundaries and limits. And then again, touching on our need for personal support systems, those help us as well as we seek to provide empathic support to others. So I just want to tap into any chats that we might have or questions we might have. So Heather King, I see, says something about sitting on the deck.
And that's the only new one that I see.
Okay. And then Dan Bailey, I'm going to just dismiss that because we've already addressed it. So do we have any additional comments about connecting and separating, or if you're comfortable with the term about detaching? Anybody have comments they want to make?
Please raise your hand if you have comments so we can call on you.
Yeah.
We look forward to hearing from you.
Chris Hines has raised his hand.
Hello?
Hi.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Yeah, Charles Hines, not Chris Hines. But
Oh, I'm sorry, Charles. I apologize.
That's okay. As far as detachment, it's an art, really, because it's easy to get tied up so deeply into the problems of others and take it home. It took me quite a while to learn how to separate work from home.
Yeah.
Quite a bit, because some cases are deep enough and so familiar because of my journey that it's easy to take it home if I don't get a shut off point. So it took me quite a while to learn to separate the two. Anyway, thanks for letting me share that.
Hey, thank you, Charles. Anybody else? If you raise your hand, we can unmute you. Maybe somebody we haven't heard from so far.
I see Nathaniel. Nathaniel, you can talk.
Hi, yeah, I like the part where you said about having your presence. It's about being present to be able to help and motivate people to find their own presence, I believe, when you're trying to connect and separate, but always trying to keep the attention on assisting them, not trying to, not trying to make them do something they don't want to do. It's just me trying to start helping them become accountable in a positive way to themselves, and me being present and trying to show them through my own experiences how this can be attained. But all the time realizing that I'm really just a messenger and I'm just there to try and help to motivate them in any way I possibly can. And when I leave, I can't take any of what they had with them with me. Does that make sense?
It makes a ton of sense. Thank
Okay.
you very much, Nathaniel.
Thank you. Thank
And
you.
I wonder if we could unmute Lucy Todd. She's made some really good contributions throughout. Lucy, would you be willing to share? I see you're adding things in the chat box, but maybe you could amplify some of the chat entries you've made.
In essence, what I posted recently was that doctors detach from patients often, and we must learn from their model. It's something that they've learned to do. And as we're helping people, you know, to find their paths and to realize that there's a better way, we can't continue to recall or revisit everything that we've gone through and they've gone through as we leave to return to our homes or other activities that we're involved in. It's something that we have to innately just learn to do. It's a learned behavior. I talk to people, I've helped people, I mean, over the years, you have to learn to really give it your all when you're there connecting, but when you disconnect and you move on, because if you don't, you'll find that you'll become so heavily laden that you'll find yourself in worse conditions than you were previously. So it's a learned behavior that I think that we need to consider, as you said, detachment.
Yeah, and again, I honor the fact that some people may not, they might find that word distasteful because of some of the ways that they've received care themselves. So think about it as that connection, which is critical, but then also separation is as critical. So, and then I think this supervision, Lucy, is so important because we really have to learn what's ours and what's not ours. And when we're starting to take on the challenges someone else is facing, we need supervisors or support systems that can help us to sort through that.
Absolutely.
And to make that separation.
Thank you so much, Owen.
What's that?
I said, thank you so much, Owen.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your contributions. Anybody else?
I see Nikki Sharpton.
Okay, Nikki.
Hi, everybody. Hello?
Hello. We can hear you.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit, just to piggyback off of Ms. Lucy. I find detachment to be difficult sometimes, but I also have support. I also have outlets. And a lot of times, you know, when I dive into the participant or I dive into the client or I dive into the peer, you know, in turn, I have to dive into myself, whether it's reading or doing things that enjoy me in order for me to build myself up in order to go on into the next day and do it all over again.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then we got Benjamin Young also.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Benjamin.
And I appreciate what Lucy shared. It is a process. Over time, I've learned to share that you have to distinguish between whose luggage belongs to who. Stop carrying other people's luggage is the way I refer to it when I help peers. So over time, it's a learned process because like you said, Owen, we all leave encounters with a level of secondary trauma, whether it's knowing or unknowingly. So it's a process and it's a fine line. And over time, I've not mastered it. Occasionally, I'm caught off guard, maybe, or whatever you call it, and I have to pull myself back. But it's a distinction between what belongs to me and what belongs to the other peer. Thank you for letting me share that.
Thanks, Benjamin. The other opportunity I'd like to take, because we have maybe we could spend 5 minutes now hearing what people are doing. And Dwayne is going to send you a worksheet with some ideas to think about things you can do in these 5 areas to support your care of self. But maybe some people in the group could raise their hands and share with us some of the things you're currently doing. I saw Heather shared that she sits on the deck, and that gives her an opportunity for self-care. So she might be building self-awareness in there, or just having a quiet time. But what are some of the things people do to care for yourselves and help you in either preventing or addressing self-care? So here's the form we're going to send you with some ideas of suggestions, but what are you currently doing? Vicki says that I go on trips out of town, such as camping with my girl tribe. Heather King, I love sitting on my deck and listening to nature for my self-care. Anybody else? You can either raise your hand and we'll unmute you, or you can add some things in the chat box. And as I say, we'll send out this worksheet, but also some of you are already doing things. So Sonia Middleton, Ron, so Sonia Middleton paints and meditates every day. Ron White does meditation and journaling, and Nikki Sharpton does reflections and journaling. Dr. Todd enjoys reading and playing her bass guitar. Charles Hines reads and draws. Charity Marcus does yoga. Anybody want to share verbally if you raise your hand? Christopher Sheffield has his hand raised.
Hello, everyone, again. Self-care, one of the things that I've learned, I learned this in a meeting years ago. This young lady from Atlanta was speaking, and she talked about, she had identified that because she was so immersed by her work and her recovery life, that all of her conversations were actually drug related, either about recovery or about addiction itself. And one of the things she said that she found to be very healthy, and I found it to be quite healthy in my own life, is that in my life, I try to incorporate a diverse audience of people so that I have diverse conversations about various issues that are unrelated to addiction or recovery. And I can, in some small way, I can be a part of the rest of the universe without feeling entrapped, because it's very easy for me anyway to be totally immersed in my entire life being all about addiction education or recovery, because not only am I a peer, but I'm a certified addictions counselor as well as a peer recovery specialist and supervisor. So oftentimes my conversations are about things related to the profession, either that or to my profession at large, because I do a number of things. So I try to put some diversity in my life and be connected to the rest of the universe in a way through conversation with people who know little or have very little desire to have the conversations that I usually have on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you so much, Christopher. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to just open it up for any final comments or questions that people might have. And again, if you raise your hand, we'll unmute you.
Sharon in the comments says, I'm making an, whoa, that's a loaded question. Hold on. I make an intentional point to pray for the ability to address the needs of women and children that I provide services for. Dr. Lucy Todd says, also learning to detach from friends that discuss their career challenges. My best friend is a criminal attorney and enjoys discussing her murder cases in detail, and I found it necessary to detach from extensive conversations with her. Oh. So those were comments, they weren't questions.
Yeah. So anybody raise your hand, and we've got a few minutes left. If you have any overall comments or any questions, we would invite you to share them with the group. Anybody, somebody we haven't heard from?
All you got to do is raise your hand, guys, and I'll allow you to talk and share. We got Sharon. Okay, Sharon, just unmute yourself and you can take the floor.
Okay, I just wanted to thank you for this format. I wanted to thank everybody who shared. This is a very, very important part of what we deal with as we engage in the different aspects of services to people with special needs, whether it be drug and alcohol abuse, mental health, or all of the above. And that this job is not for everybody, but when you find your calling and you engage in it, one thing that the reason why I put that in the chat was because I don't always have physically or mentally what I need to address each young lady or child that walks into my life or whose path I cross. So I don't know if my higher power has the strength to do that and to instill that in me. I rely a lot on that. That way, when I start giving of myself to the point where I'm getting burned out or stressed or even resentful and angry at times, I have an avenue to go to with which to release those things. And I also have come to realize that I don't always have everything I need to help each person. And one of the gentlemen shared that the bigger their issues get and the more, what should I say, the more devastating their life experiences that they're sharing with you or that you are there to help with, it's harder on us because we're only human. And I just want to thank everybody who came together to discuss this because it's so important. And thank you for letting me share that.
Thank you, Sharon. Any other comments? So Dwayne sent you a link for the worksheet, and then I will make sure you get a copy of the slides from today and also the slides from the last time. There's some overlap, so you'll see where the overlap is. Other questions, comments?
A public service of Mobley & Associates at iWriteSafe.com. Have a car? The title.
Somebody's not muted and we can hear some background noise. I do want to talk about some resources, and you'll find this list of resources. Oh, one thing before we go. So if you find yourself needing help, make sure you reach out. So some of you have employers who have employee assistance programs. That's a resource. You can always call the CARES Warm Line. That's a resource. Georgia Mental Health Consumer Network has a peer-to-peer line, and that's a resource. There's the Georgia Crisis and Access line. That's a resource. SAMHSA has a disaster distress helpline, and you can call that helpline. Or there is, should you be thinking about suicide, there's a National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So those are all resources available to you if you find yourself at the point where you really need some support and your normal support systems aren't providing you that support. Also, I do have on here a list of resources, and there are links. When we send out the slides, you'll see the links are there to each of the resources that I cited here, and also some additional ones that are background information that went into the preparation of this webinar. So we have a lot of information if you're interested and you want to dig deeper. And then I do think we have some chats. Let's make sure we cover them. Anything, Dwayne, that you want to add?
Julie says, thank you for the presentation. I reminded everybody that I will send PDFs if that link doesn't work. I'll send out worksheet PDFs and also the PDF of the entire presentation and the last one. So they'll have that information. I think Nikki asked early on, will there be a certificate? No, there will not. We will send you a thank you, and we will, all you have to do is keep track of your credits. But Nikki, you're good for until 2021. So that's all I got.
Okay. And then Dan Bailey mentioned that the link is not hyperlinked, but we'll send everything out by email. Loree, did you have something?
Yes, I just want to say, when you're keeping up with your CEUs, can you please write down the month, who the presenter was, and the topic for the webinar. That's what you will submit at the end of the year for each webinar that you attend. And I just want to tell y'all, I appreciate everybody for coming. And thank you, Owen. It's always a pleasure to work with you. Thank you.
Same here, Loree. And Loree and Dwayne, thank you very much for your support today. You made it all happen. So it was great to be with you.
Thank you.
All righty. Dwayne, I'll send you those slides right now from both presentations.
Sounds good. Thank you again, Owen, and thanks
All right.
everybody for coming.
Thanks, everybody.